A causal clause is the type of clause, and remember, a clause has to have a subject and a verb in order to be a clause. It's a subordinate clause, that's it. It's not a main clause, that tells you why something happened. It's how to say because in Latin. So it gives us the cause of the main clause. Now, I want to just draw your attention, because this is not because of, like propter, which is a preposition. And it means because of, and is followed by the accusative. So, if I were to say, because of Caesar, propter Caesarem, the Gauls were afraid. That's not what we're talking about here. This is a causal phrase. Right? We have no subject, we have no verb, so propter because of. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about clauses that begin with the word because. So, one way that I want to just review or remind you that you can use an ablative absolute. Remember, an ablative absolute is going to have a noun and a preposition in the ablative that can be translated as a cause. Doesn't have to be, but it can be translated as a cause. So, ablative absolute could show causality. So, for example, equis correntibus pueri timent. Because the horses were running, the boy is afraid. Or the boys are afraid. Because the horses are running, the boys are afraid. Because the horses are running. Or, sociis interfectis, hostes victi sunt. Sociis interfectis here is our ablative absolute. Because the allies were killed, the enemies were conquered. The enemy was conquered. So, because the allies were killed, because the horses are running. What we want to do is look at the use of quod, quia, and quoniam to mean because. And each of these can be translated as because, or some people say that quia is since, or quoniam is since, but treat them as because. And they're generally followed by the indicative. An indicative, so they're going to begin. Quod, quia, or quoniam begins the clause, and the main verb is, the verb in that clause is going to be in the indicative. Later you'll learn that it could be followed by the subjunctive. But for our purposes, we've got a verb, a finite verb. So, parthos timeo, I fear the Parthians. Our clause begins here. Quod, because. And there's our verb. Remember, a clause has to have a verb. Because I distrust our troops. Or here, neque me vixisse paenitet. It doesn't, I'm not ashamed to have lived. Quoniam. There's our clause, the beginning of our clause. Quoniam, because I lived well. And there's our verb in the causal clause. Or cur igitur pacem nolo, why don't I want peace? Quia, because it is base. It is foul. So when you see this quod, quoniam, or quia, and it's the beginning of a clause, you should say, it possibly means because. Now, you may, if you're clever, say, but isn't there quod, the relative pronoun? That? Yep, there is. And you're going to have to be able to distinguish between quod, meaning because, or quod, the relative. Well, I'll give you two simple rules. These aren't foolproof, but it's a good place to start. So first, the conjunction quod, meaning because, will often come after a verb or at the start of a sentence. Okay, it'll come after the verb because it's starting. You've completed one clause, and you're beginning another. Or, as we do in English, you may start a sentence with a because such and such, this is the case. So, for example, quod canes amabat, because he loved dogs, non felis habebat, he did not have cats. So there the sentence begins with quod, we're going to treat it as because. Or doctus es, there's our verb, we can break. You are learned because you know Latin. Quod Latinam scis. So, if you see quod at the beginning of a sentence or after a verb, your first instinct should be treat it as because. The relative pronoun quod, the that or which, will usually come after a neuter noun. Remember, quod is neuter and singular. Quod, the relative pronoun that is neuter and singular. So, if it's being used as a relative pronoun, you're likely going to have a neuter singular antecedent. So in this sentence, Brindisium est oppidum. Brindisium is a town, quod, which, so oppidum is neuter and singular, which Horatius visitavit, which Horace visited. And if all else fails, treat quod first as which, then treat it as because, or vice versa, and see which one makes sense. You wouldn't say Brindisium is a town because Horace visited. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are a few other ways to do causal, to show causality in Latin. You won't really get to these until you know the subjunctive. So for now, keep these two rules of thumb in mind. And when you see quod, quoniam, or quia, translate it as because.